Hey, so I wanted to talk a little bit about the history of the role of the vice president. Um, I think it's kind of fitting to talk about the beginning of the United States and the republic that the founding fathers of it built, and the nature and obsession of checks and balances that Ben Franklin had, among others. And I wanted to point out how certain ideas in the United States Republic, like the Electoral College, were based on Ben Franklin's fascination with education. He was one of the first people to set up public schools in the American colonies and in the new country of America, or the United States at the time. And he was also the one with the crazy idea that if we're going to have voting, which he wasn't a huge fan of the idea of voting, if we're going to have voting, make sure that the people who are running against each other, the two people who make it to essentially the finals, and you have that, showdown with the two main picks for the election after the primaries, make sure that the loser becomes the vice president. And this is something that really, really felt like a conundrum when I was learning American history growing up, that all the way until, I think it was John F. Kennedy, did the nominee, the opposition nominee, when they lost the election, they became the vice president. Put down in the comments if you know who the last person to run against somebody for president that became vice president. If you know that factoid, put that in the comments if you know it. And I'm quite fascinated by this. And the more I learn about, things like peer-to-peer technology, distributed networks, decentralized networks, my fascination with Bitcoin over the years and blockchain, and now to other even more open and decentralized projects, I've really started to understand certain nuance differentiators, like the difference between privacy and secrecy, and the value of transparency in a world that struggles with privacy issues, and the power of transparency when applied to, practical everyday applications, such as like witness protection programs, and why celebrities don't have more stalkers than they do, and why they're actually as safe as somebody in witness protection programs, celebrities where they're a household name and face. And I've started to really be fascinated by transparency, and especially with somebody who, little transparency here, I used to be a chronic impulsive liar. And transparency was something I resisted at all costs. And now I'm understanding the immense value of transparency, and seeing things like, the loser in an election becoming vice president, the second most powerful man in the executive branch, was given to the runner-up. And I thought, well, that's a way to really, make the vice president, a non-essential player on the team. And then I started to ask myself, why did they stop doing that? why would they say? And I'm like, well, they want people there that, understand what they're trying to build. Of course they'd stop that, what I thought was a tradition, but it was actually a heuristic. Heuristics are kind of like these protocols, or almost irrational protocols for self-check, or checking like these human biases that we have for human perspective. So everybody suffers from certain human biases, and heuristics are kind of like, well, we do this because we have a natural bias towards this or this or this. And they have them in medicine, they have them in business, they have them in war, they have them in everything. Like, heuristics are everywhere. But one of the original heuristics of the United States, back when it was the United States with a lowercase u, as written in the Constitution, as opposed to the corporate United States, which is, the industrial corporation. It doesn't have anything to do with being anti-business. I'm not anti-business or anti-capitalist. I do, however, understand the history of these types of contracts as they were written. And one of the things that Ben Franklin was very, very wise to suggest is that the runner-up become vice president. And it's all started to click recently that was for the sake of transparency. It was somebody who was guaranteed to be in office, and they were there for the sake of transparency. They reported to the other party, and they were there in every meeting that the president was. They had full access, just like the president. Like, they had the same level of transparency as the president, and they were tied to another party. So at that point, like, they had the privilege to be the eyes and the ears for the people who essentially lost the election. And it was that transparency before we had, the press industry that we do now that wants that role to essentially audit politics. This was cooked in there. And this was a tradition that is one of those things. It's like the golden rule. It's like, yeah, you don't have to respect the golden rule, but if you say that the golden rule is a dumb rule, then, you're probably not a good person. You're probably a cheat. You're probably a liar. You're probably, dishonest. Coming from somebody who used to be a chronic liar, an impulsive liar. Like, I can understand that anybody who isn't for the idea of that kind of transparency is trying to reason away their distrust to the point where they don't trust other people to have oversight over them. And what's really interesting is when this tradition stopped, I think really the heart and soul of the checks and balances was destroyed. And now it's like, everything that was built is kind of like a zombie walking around. Like, the American Republic is like a zombie, or like, it's just become this cancerous, immortal being that can't die, but so riddled with cancer that it's just, this monster. This very, very sick monster that's just trying to console its pain and torture because it can't die. So it's just consuming anything that makes it feel better. And I think that's really, really interesting that this was cooked in there. It was one of those things where it's like, they didn't really need to explain why, but if people got rid of it and they were okay getting rid of it on both sides, then we were no longer a republic. We were no longer a democracy with checks and balances. We had become the very thing that Ben Franklin was terrified of when it came to democracy, the very thing that Socrates got killed for talking about democracy, is the demagogues. And the demagogues are the masses that are warring for control and will kill anybody who doesn't want to be a part of their demagogue. It's this war of the masses where they won't be okay until the other half of the world is essentially, either physically, spiritually, or ideologically dead. And I think that's really interesting because it's never-ending war with demagogues, to the point where they either end up enslaving their opponents, wiping them out, killing them, whatever. Like, this is what happened time and time again. This is what Socrates got killed for, reminding people of. And I just think it's really interesting that the one person that understood this in the founding of the United States was really the only person that was really against democracy. And this was a lot to do with the fact that they didn't have reliable means of communication to organize things. So how did they make sure certain voices got heard? They decided to use democracy. They didn't have a formal education system set up. They didn't have any means of communicating education. Like, they didn't even have schools. Like, Ben Franklin believed completely that education, if people understood logic and philosophy, that everything would find balance anyways, that this was a means to an end, that the American Republic was a means to an end to invest in public education, access to educational materials for those that are self-directed, resources for people who want to mentor people to learn how to become self-directed when it came to education. And that's what Ben Franklin believed that America could eventually become, and we wouldn't even need the republic that we built. That's what he hoped for. And it's really, really interesting how people who want control, they tend to fight against this. And what's really interesting is it's kind of like right now with the current two-party system, it's kind of like we have a bully that's so big that we can only see one arm at a time. So we keep thinking, oh man, this left arm is brutal. Like, that left hook is brutal. Then other people are like, what are you talking about? That right hook is brutal. Like, you know, you guys are just bullies. When really they're just beating each other up. And that's really, really crazy, because this is what Ben Franklin warned everyone about up until the day he died. And I don't know, just thinking a lot about that. Like, why don't we have that kind of transparency? Like, a literal, somebody who is literally in bed with the opposition, like, in there to be a fly on the wall in every meeting, can look at everything the president can, but yet isn't in the same party as them. Like, why don't we still have that check and balance? Like, what, like, without that, you can run into the problem of an illusion of options. You can run into superficial differences, or, you know, that 50-50 split of the same person, like a bully so big that you think the two arms are two different beings. And I'm not saying whether or not that is. I mean, nobody really knows whether or not, you know, anything other than we can see is the truth. We kind of have to take a step back for ourselves and ask ourselves what we see, not even what we want to believe. Like, this, the crazy thing is if you talk about what people should believe or what they need to believe, that's essentially conspiracy theory. If you're saying that you know better than someone, that's just conspiracy theory. But, like, really, like, I'm just asking people, like, maybe, like, this is all so crazy. Like, I feel like the world we live in is all so crazy that, like, isn't the opposite of crazy still crazy? So, like, it's not even about, like, whether or not we believe in conspiracy theories anymore. It feels like, what flavor of conspiracy theory do people believe in? Like, even now, not believing in conspiracy theories kind of feels the same as believing in conspiracy theories. And we've gotten to a point where we have to ask ourselves, all right, like, let me take a step back and look at things and ask myself these simple questions that we should be able to ask other people. Like, why not have, you know, the losing candidate become the vice president? Like, why not? Why aren't you okay with that kind of oversight? Why aren't you okay with that kind of, you know, that sort of check and balance? Like, do you believe in, you know, the public's right to know? Or do you believe in secrecy so much that, like, you don't want to guarantee that you're going to play ball and not hide secrets from people when, you make a mistake? And that's the sort of thing that, like, a vice president can understand. Like, if somebody makes a mistake, it's like they're not going to want to use that as a weapon unless they're, really, really doing things bad. But we're at a point now where I'm afraid that, like, everyone's doing things that are so bad when they're in a position of power that, like, there's no way that the government could function as normal by doing something like that, which ironically I feel like means that it's probably the solution we need if they can't function as normal. Like, we don't want normal, we want better. So, like, if it's painful for them, like, that's what we want that painful where they are accountable to us, and that's it. Not where they're responsible for what they want to be responsible for. Like, they're accountable to us, even if it means risking losing everything to be transparent with us. And that's the sort of thing where, like, I don't want to accept any explanation. I want to know, whether or not they will or won't do that, because it's super obvious what's right. Like, they should all have that sort of check and balance built into every single seat of power in the United States. Like, every single seat of power should have their loser there with them, with the same access as them, that accountability. Like, it just makes sense. It's just logical. And it's not something that can be reasoned around. Nobody has a position that is so secretive that they can't have somebody that could be there to blow the whistle on them if they're endangering the lives of the people, especially somebody who's trying to have that position. They're not going to want to just get in there and, like, really cheat to get that person out, because they'll have that same thing. Like, somebody else will get in there to have that. So it's like, there's a lot of risk involved with being a whistleblower. So, like, I think that's a really wise check and balance that somebody I know a lot smarter than myself came up with, that I don't know why I wasn't taught this. I don't know why nobody knew this to teach this to me growing up. And from what I can tell is there's no generations alive that really knew about this, that were taught this on a basic level. Like, some people learned it and researched it later, but, like, let me know in the comments, like, if you made it this far into this video, let me know in the comments if you were taught this in, like, elementary school or any of those fundamental classes of American history. Let me know, like, who, shout out to the teacher who taught you this, who informed you on this. But if you didn't know about this, if you didn't know that was the nature of the vice presidency, for a very long time, from the beginning of the United States onwards for a while, put that in the comments too. Like, let people know that you weren't taught that. Let people know that you want that kind of transparency, because we should all have that security that we have somebody to advocate for us in case we're being, threatened because we have a different political ideology, a different religious ideology, a different philosophy of being. We should be able to have that kind of check and balance. And the thing is you don't even have to subscribe specifically to the opposition, because, like, if that person, like, is truly ethical, unless everyone is corrupt who's running for power, then, like, it should be okay. But, like, the very thing is if everyone's corrupt, then they should have no problem implementing this. No problem, no hesitation to implementing this. But if everyone isn't corrupt, then they run a big risk of losing control. And that's the very thing where, like, we have nothing to lose, even if, because I don't believe that everyone who wants to run for a position of power is corrupt. I just believe they're not corrupt enough to win. So at this point, if we can at least get that runner-up a seat at the table to be accountable to even the opposition of the winner, then I think we all benefit from that, especially if it happens across the board. And this is something we can all demand. And this is something I think that, if they don't do this, we'll know whether or not they're on our side or whether or not we live in, what Rick and Morty say, just slavery with more steps. I don't know if I'm ready to believe that, like, we're the same thing as slaves of old or whatever, but, like, indentured servitude was slavery with more steps. It was somewhat voluntary. A lot of people who got into it regretted it. And that feels a lot like, I feel like what a lot of people feel like they got into with, the American grind, the American dream. They feel like they agreed to something that if they had had more context, they probably wouldn't have. And I think that's something really, really important to keep in mind here too, that if you feel a little duped when you're thinking about the solutions that need to be had, everyone is. Let's just put that out there. Like, I feel duped almost every day. Like, that's it. Like, I've just gotten so used, I've conditioned myself to feeling duped that, like, I've started to be able to see clearly now, like, what is within my control, what is within my power, like, what I can do, like, what I can do for the world. And I've stopped really asking what the world can do for me, and everything's changed. My whole perspective has changed. My self-confidence has gone up, my ego has gone down. Like, it's quite fascinating. Like, living with less depression, less anxiety, more motivation. It's just been phenomenal. So these are just some thoughts, probably crazy thoughts, who knows? Like, so looking forward to your thoughts on this. Maybe you know somebody who may have some thoughts on this. Feel free to share it with them. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention. Please feel free to join me for my personal unschooling at libraryofconsciousness.com. That's www.libraryofconsciousness.com. Thank you.